Get out, now! Big Shaq stared at the blood-red words spray-painted across his garage. His security cameras were down. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. A cold voice whispered through the receiver. You have 24 hours to disappear, or we make you. Shaq exhaled slowly. They had no idea who they were threatening. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The sun hung low over the coastline, casting a golden shimmer on the waves. Ocean View Estates was the kind of neighborhood where wealth didn't just exist, it ruled. Here, new faces weren't common, and when they did appear, they weren't always welcome. Shaquille Shaq Johnson stepped out of his black Rolls-Royce, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored navy suit. At 6'3", with a confident stride, he was impossible to ignore. But the moment his polished dress shoes touched the pavement, an eerie shift settled over the neighborhood. Conversations on porches stalled. Curtains twitched. A middle-aged man watering his roses suddenly found something very interesting about his hose. Near the grand ivory-colored estate, a woman stood waiting. Platinum blonde bob, pearl necklace, crisp navy blazer. Mrs. Kensington, the real estate agent. She turned with her usual polished grace, ready to greet the buyer. But the moment she saw Shaq, her smile flickered. Just for a second. Her handshake tightened. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face. Mr. Johnson? She asked, like she was hoping she had the wrong name. Shaq smirked, used to this routine. That's me. Her eyes darted. First to the security guard stationed at the gated entrance, then to a trio of older women on a balcony, all whispering behind manicured hands. Shaq didn't need to hear them to know what they were saying. Who is he? Why is he here? Mrs. Kensington cleared her throat, plastering on a smile. I must admit I wasn't expecting... She stopped herself, face flushing. Shall we take a tour? Shaq didn't need a tour. He had memorized every inch of this house from the listing. The marble countertops, the infinity pool that melted into the ocean view, the private beach access. This wasn't just a home. It was a statement. But still, he followed her inside. The grand foyer was silent except for the echo of their footsteps against Italian marble. She walked too fast, as if eager to get this over with. This is the primary living space, she said stiffly. Floor-to-ceiling windows, imported tile, and... I'll take it. Mrs. Kensington blinked. Pardon? I said I'll take it. Full asking price. Wire transfer today. A pause. Silence stretched between them. Outside, more neighbors had gathered, pretending to check their mail or take a casual evening stroll. Except their eyes never left Shaq. Mrs. Kensington reached into her leather folder and pulled out the keys, but just before handing them over, she hesitated. Her voice lowered. Just a heads up, the neighbors might not be welcoming. Shaq took the keys, grip firm, gaze steady. Then they'll just have to get used to me. Outside, the whispers grew louder. Shaq stepped out onto his porch, stretching as the crisp ocean air filled his lungs. He had barely been here a day, yet something already felt off. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against his back. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. Then, he saw it. A single white envelope placed neatly at the center of his welcome mat. No postage, no return address. Just his name, scrawled in jagged black ink. Frowning, he tore it open. You don't belong here. The words sent a slow, simmering heat down his spine. His jaw clenched. He looked up, scanning the row of pristine houses lined along the cul-de-sac. Large, sprawling estates, each one an architectural masterpiece. White pillars, manicured lawns, wraparound porches. But something was missing. People. There were no morning joggers, no dog walkers, no friendly neighbors stopping by to introduce themselves. Instead, doors were slightly ajar, just enough for someone to peek through. A curtain shifted in the house across the street. Shaq locked eyes with an elderly woman inside. She stared at him for a second too long before the curtain snapped shut. So this is how it's gonna be. He exhaled sharply, crumpling the note in his fist before stepping down onto the pavement. Maybe they didn't want him here. Maybe they thought they could scare him away. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Mr. Johnson. The deep, deliberate voice made him turn. A man in a crisp charcoal suit stood at the edge of his driveway, arms crossed over his chest. Silver hair, sharp features, an air of practiced dominance. This wasn't just a neighbor. This was someone used to power. Mr. Langston, the man said, as if his name alone should mean something. His wife, Victoria, stood beside him, statuesque, perfectly styled, and radiating the kind of quiet hostility that needed no words. Shaq lifted his chin. Morning. Langston didn't return the pleasantry. His gaze swept over Shaq's Rolls-Royce parked in the driveway, his tailored suit, the way he carried himself like he belonged. The corner of his mouth twitched, just barely. Hope you enjoy your stay, he said, voice dripping with something that wasn't quite a threat, but wasn't friendly either. Ocean View Estates is a particular kind of community. Victoria smiled, but her eyes were cold. We like to keep things traditional. Shaq let their words hang between them, absorbing the weight of what they weren't saying. Then a new voice broke the tension. Hey there, neighbor! A man jogged up with an easy grin, hands tucked into his khaki shorts. Short brown hair, lean build. He looked like the kind of guy who owned a boat but never actually used it. Daniel Carter, the man said, extending a hand. Welcome to the neighborhood. Shaq shook it, noting the strength in his grip. Daniel seemed relaxed, friendly. Too friendly. If you ever need anything, man, help with the HOA, some insider tips, just say the word. Something about the way he said insider made Shaq's stomach twist, but he kept his expression neutral. I'll keep that in mind. Daniel shot him a wink. Smart move. Shaq watched as he walked off, whistling like he didn't have a care in the world. Langston and Victoria followed, their presence lingering even after they disappeared behind their mansion's iron gates. The moment they were gone, Shaq let out a slow breath. His gut told him Daniel was hiding something. As for Langston and his wife, that was outright hostility. Later that night, after unpacking a few boxes, Shaq stepped outside to take out the trash. The moment he reached the curb, his steps faltered. His trash cans were overturned. The words "Leave" were spray-painted in blood red across the pavement. Shaq tightened his fists, his pulse hammering. They weren't just unwelcoming. They were making a statement, and so was he. He wasn't going anywhere. The crisp morning air did nothing to cool the slow burn in Shaq's chest. He stood at his front door, staring at the bold red notice taped right in the center. You have 48 hours to fix this violation. Violation? What violation? Ripping the paper off, he scanned the details, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. Lawn. Excessively green. Car. Too large for community aesthetics. Mailbox. Non-standard. Shaq scoffed, shaking his head. His lawn was professionally maintained. His luxury SUV was parked neatly in the driveway, just like half the residents here. And his mailbox? Identical to every other one on the block. This wasn't about rules. It was about him. A slow clap from behind made him turn. Daniel Carter stood at the edge of the driveway, smirking. Welcome to Ocean View's special treatment. Shaq crossed his arms. This normal around here? Daniel tilted his head. Not for everyone, just for folks who don't fit the mold. There it was. Shaq exhaled through his nose, keeping his voice steady. They're not scaring me off. Daniel sighed, like he was talking to a stubborn child. Look, man, you're rich, I get it. But the HOA? They don't lose. They bury people in violations and legal fees until they have no choice but to sell. Shaq's jaw tightened. They can try. Daniel shrugged. Suit yourself. Just know, they always have a way to win. He patted Shaq's shoulder before walking off, whistling. Shaq watched him disappear down the street. Fake ally. He could smell it a mile away. By noon, 2 more violation letters arrived, one for a porch light exceeding wattage limits, another for improperly aligned front steps. Shaq barely had time to process it when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. This is Shaq, a smooth, clipped voice answered. Mr. Johnson, this is Thomas Reynolds from the Ocean View Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your ongoing non-compliance. Shaq leaned against his counter. Non-compliance? You've received multiple warnings. Failure to correct them in 48 hours will result in additional fines and legal action. And then there's the zoning issue. Shaq's eyes narrowed. What zoning issue? A deliberate pause. Then Reynolds chuckled. One that might make your purchase invalid. Shaq's grip on his phone tightened. That's a bluff. A smirk practically dripped through the receiver. Check your paperwork. Oh, wait. You might not be able to. A shame if your real estate agent wasn't available anymore. Click. Shaq stared at his phone, heart pounding. They weren't just trying to fine him. They were trying to erase him. That night, Shaq sat at his kitchen table, laptop open, researching HOA lawsuits. This wasn't a neighborhood issue. This was a targeted attack. Then he thought of Mrs. Kensington, the real estate agent. If anyone had proof his purchase was solid, it was her. He dialed her number. Voicemail. He tried again. Nothing. Frowning, he searched her real estate firm's website. But when he clicked on her profile, "This agent is no longer available." Shaq's stomach twisted. Mrs. Kensington hadn't just gone silent. She had vanished. Shaq stood by his window, fingers gripping the curtain's edge as he watched the neighborhood. The street was quiet, but he could feel it. The weight of their stares from behind pristine glass windows. The hushed conversations on manicured porches. They thought they could push him out, just like they had done before. They had no idea who they were dealing with. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to his contacts. There was only one person who would understand why this fight wasn't just about a house. The call barely rang twice before Dion picked up. "Yo, what's good, bro?" Shaq exhaled, his jaw tight. "They're trying to push me out." Dion went silent for a moment. "They messing with you already?" Shaq sank into a chair, rubbing his forehead. "It's deeper than that. Violations, zoning lies. Even my realtor vanished. This ain't about rules, it's about me." Dion let out a slow breath. "Man, I knew this was personal the moment you told me where you were moving." Shaq closed his eyes, letting the memories flood back. Shaq sat across from his grandmother, her frail hands wrapped around a porcelain teacup, the sunlight catching the silver strands in her hair. "You see that house?" she had said, pointing through the cafe window at a grand white estate across the street. "I used to clean that place." Shaq followed her gaze, frowning. "For real?" She nodded, her expression soft but distant. "I remember dusting the shelves, setting the table, but I was never allowed to walk through the front door like a guest." His grandmother had smiled then, but there was something behind it, a sadness he had never been able to shake. "I used to dream about living in a house like that," she had whispered. "Somewhere they couldn't tell me I didn't belong." Shaq's grip tightened around his phone. That house, his house, was a symbol. It wasn't just about money or status, it was about belonging. And now, they wanted to rip it away. "Dion," Shaq said, his voice firm. "I need the best damn lawyer in the city." The next morning, Shaq sat in a sleek downtown office across from Jared Holloway, a powerhouse attorney known for taking down corrupt institutions. Jared skimmed through the stack of HOA documents Shaq had brought, his expression unreadable. Then he chuckled. "These violations are garbage. Excessively green lawn? That's not even a thing. They don't care about legal," Shaq muttered. "They want me gone." Jared leaned back, tapping a pen against the desk. "They're testing you, seeing if you'll fold." He smirked. "They're gonna regret this." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Jared slid a thick folder across the desk. "I started digging before this meeting. You're not the first black homeowner they've tried to push out." Shaq's pulse kicked up. "What do you mean?" Jared flipped through pages, pointing at highlighted names. "Past black residents in this neighborhood? Almost all of them left within 2 years. Every single one hit with zoning issues, sudden violations, lawsuits." He tapped another paper. "And check this. There's a buried HOA amendment that was mysteriously edited 20 years ago. It allows the board to revoke property ownership under community preservation laws." Shaq's stomach dropped. "You're telling me they have a legal loophole to take my house?" Jared's smirk returned. "If we let them." That night, Shaq sat at his desk, staring at the laptop screen. His phone buzzed, a blocked number. Curious, he hesitated before answering. "Who's this?" A robotic voice crackled through the line. "Check your email, you need to see this." Then the call disconnected. Heart pounding, Shaq refreshed his inbox. One new message, no sender, no subject, just an attachment. He clicked. The document loaded, a HOA meeting transcript. As he read through it, his hands curled into fists. They were discussing him, planning his removal, fabricating violations. This wasn't paranoia. It was a setup. He exhaled sharply, reaching for his phone to call Jared, when suddenly his security monitor flickered. Then it cut to black. Shaq's stomach twisted. His security cameras had just been disabled. Someone was outside. The HOA president's face turned pale as the reporter shoved a microphone in his face. "Do you deny these racist allegations?" The cameras flashed. A crowd had gathered outside the Ocean View Estates Community Center, murmurs rippling like an incoming storm. Reporters elbowed for position, shoving microphones closer. The HOA president, Richard Langston, usually the picture of confidence, looked like a man trapped in a burning building. "That's absurd," he stammered, adjusting his tie. His usual smooth arrogance cracked under the weight of the cameras. The HOA operates with fairness and professionalism. Any suggestion of discrimination is baseless. "Then how do you explain the leaked HOA documents?" The reporter shot back, holding up printed pages. "These minutes show explicit discussions about removing black homeowners through fabricated violations and legal loopholes." A ripple of gasps spread through the crowd. Langston opened his mouth, then closed it. His jaw clenched. Shaq stood at the edge of the chaos, arms crossed, watching. His blood boiled, but he forced himself to stay silent. This moment wasn't about yelling. This was about exposure. Behind him, his lawyer Jared Holloway grinned. "You seeing this? They're drowning." Shaq exhaled slowly. Not enough. Not yet. The press had caught wind of the story after the anonymous leak of HOA documents. The moment journalists saw words like community preservation and non-traditional homeowners, they pounced. Within 48 hours, the story had gone national. Now, news vans lined the streets. Satellite dishes pointed toward Ocean View Estates like cannons locked on a target. And suddenly everything changed. By the afternoon, the neighborhood looked different. The same people who had once whispered behind Shaq's back now forced polite smiles as cameras rolled past their homes. Neighbors who had previously glared at him from porches suddenly waved, pretending they had always been welcoming. Victoria Langston, Richard's wife, was caught on camera saying, "We love diversity in our community. Shaq is such a wonderful addition." Shaq almost laughed at the hypocrisy. Just days ago, these same people had spray-painted "Leave" on his driveway. His phone buzzed. A text from Daniel Carter. "Daniel Carter, I had nothing to do with this, bro. You know I always had your back." Shaq stared at the message. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then he put the phone down. Daniel wasn't worth a response. But the HOA wasn't going down without a fight. That evening, Langston held an emergency press conference, flanked by his board members. "This attack on our community is completely unfair," he barked into the microphone. "These allegations are a smear campaign orchestrated by an outsider who refuses to follow the rules." Shaq watched the live broadcast from his living room, arms folded. "They're cornered," Jared muttered. "Now they're just swinging wild." Shaq wasn't surprised. When powerful people started losing control, they didn't admit defeat. They retaliated, and retaliation came fast. The next morning, Shaq was at his office downtown when his assistant rushed in, eyes wide. "Shaq, you need to see this." She handed him a printed document. Subject, urgent, compliance investigation. Shaq scanned the paper. His stomach dropped. His business was under investigation. A formal complaint had been filed. The reason? Financial irregularities and potential misconduct. It was bogus. Shaq clenched his jaw. They were trying to destroy him. The metallic scent of spray paint lingered in the cool morning air. Shaq stood frozen in his driveway, staring at the words, "Get out now," scrawled in dripping red across his garage door. His fists clenched at his sides. He had expected pushback. He had expected dirty tricks. But this was a declaration of war. Jared Holloway pulled up moments later, stepping out of his car with a sharp breath. "Damn." He walked closer, scanning the vandalism. "They're done playing subtle." Shaq's jaw tightened. They never were. A movement in his peripheral vision made him glance across the street. Curtains snapped shut. A car idled at the corner before rolling away. They were watching. Jared sighed. "You call the cops?" Shaq nodded. "They're on their way." Minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up. Two officers stepped out, both middle-aged, both wearing bored expressions, like this was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. One of them, Officer Grayson, scratched his chin as he eyed the graffiti. "Looks like a dumb prank." Shaq folded his arms. "A prank? Someone broke onto my property, vandalized my house, and you think it's a joke?" The other cop, a stocky guy with a coffee stain on his uniform, shrugged. Could be kids messing around. Shaq inhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm. I have security cameras. I'll pull the footage. Officer Grayson waved a dismissive hand. Yeah, you can file a report, but these things rarely lead anywhere. No real damage done, right? Shaq stepped closer. So if someone spray-painted your house in the middle of the night, you'd call it a prank too? Grayson's lips thinned. Look, Mr. Johnson, we'll file a report, but unless you have video of the guy's face, there's not much we can do. Shaq's patience snapped. Of course, because investigating crimes in this neighborhood doesn't seem to be a priority. Grayson stiffened, nostrils flaring. His partner nudged him before things escalated. We'll let you know if we find anything. The second officer muttered before they got back in their cruiser and drove off. Shaq turned to Jared, his muscles coiled with frustration. They're not going to do a damn thing. Jared exhaled. You knew they wouldn't. That night, Shaq sat in his dimly lit office, staring at his security feed. He rewound the footage from the night before. 1:42 a.m. A dark figure climbed over his backyard fence. The trespasser moved fast, dressed in black, a mask covering his face. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and left it on Shaq's patio table before slipping back into the shadows. Shaq's skin prickled. He switched cameras, trying to get a clearer shot, but the system glitched, static cutting through the feed. Someone had tampered with it. His pulse pounded as he walked outside, scanning his patio. His eyes locked onto the small white envelope, barely shifting in the breeze. Carefully, he picked it up, unfolding the note inside. Leave now, or you won't get another warning. His grip tightened around the paper. This wasn't fear. This was fury. The next morning, Shaq knocked on Daniel Carter's door. When the fake friendly neighbor answered, his expression faltered for half a second, just long enough for Shaq to see the guilt beneath his usual smirk. Shaq didn't bother with pleasantries. You working with them? Daniel's smile was slow, deliberate. I don't know what you're talking about. Shaq stepped closer, his voice low. Cut the act. I know you're in on it. Daniel sighed, glancing over Shaq's shoulder as if making sure no one was watching. Then he chuckled. You're making this harder than it has to be, man. Shaq clenched his fists. I don't scare easy. Daniel's smirk widened. See, that's the problem. Shaq took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay in control. You tell Langston and the rest of them I'm not leaving. Daniel leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Then they'll make your life hell. Shaq's phone buzzed. A text from Jared. Jared, we need to talk. They're about to escalate this. We have to strike first. Shaq looked back at Daniel, his stare ice cold. Let them try. Shaq sat in his car, his fingers wrapped tightly around his phone, thumb hovering over the record button. His heart pounded in his ears as he stared at the Ocean View HOA clubhouse, where tonight's private board meeting was about to begin. This was it, his one shot at exposing them. The past few weeks had been an all-out war. Fake violations, legal threats, intimidation tactics. They had thrown everything at him. And now, with a final eviction notice looming, Shaq knew he had to strike first. He took a slow breath, adjusting the tiny wireless mic clipped inside his jacket. One mistake and he'd be caught. Checking his phone screen, he made sure the recording app was ready. Then he stepped out of the car and walked straight into the lion's den. Inside, the HOA board members were already gathered around a long mahogany table. At the head sat Richard Langston, smug as ever, fingers steepled together. His wife, Victoria, perched beside him like a queen overseeing her subjects. The rest of the board, a group of wealthy, self-important homeowners, looked equally self-assured. They didn't expect Shaq to show up. Langston's eyebrows lifted. Mr. Johnson, I wasn't aware you'd be attending. Shaq forced a polite smile. I like to stay informed about the community I live in. A murmur ran through the room. Langston exhaled dramatically, motioning for Shaq to sit. Fine, let's begin. Shaq's phone, hidden in his jacket pocket, was already recording. At first, the meeting covered the usual nonsense. Budget reports, landscaping updates, minor community disputes. But Shaq knew better. They wouldn't discuss their real agenda until they thought no one was listening. And then, it happened. Langston leaned forward, his voice dropping. We need to accelerate the process, he said. Another board member, a bald man in a navy suit, nodded. Agreed. The media attention has complicated things, but Johnson needs to be gone. We cannot allow him to set a precedent. Victoria tapped her nails against the table. If we make this too obvious, we open ourselves up to legal trouble. Langston smirked. Which is why we're handling it quietly. The zoning board will move forward with the violation ruling, and if that doesn't work, we have other methods. Shaq kept his face neutral, but inside his pulse was thunderous. Another board member chuckled. We should have never let him by in the first place. These types always cause problems. Shaq gritted his teeth. There it was. Proof. On tape. The recording was still rolling as Langston sighed. By next week, he'll either sell or be legally forced out. Either way, Johnson won't be a problem anymore. Shaq's thumb pressed stop on the recording. Got them. He stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. Well, he said, this has been enlightening. Langston gave him a slow, knowing smile. Enjoy your last few days in Ocean View, Mr. Johnson. Shaq didn't flinch. He just turned and walked out. He had what he needed, but he also knew they weren't done yet. When Shaq got home, he expected exhaustion to hit. Instead, adrenaline burned through his veins. He had them on tape. This wasn't just some shady HOA practice. This was an organized, systemic effort to push black homeowners out. He sat down at his desk, replaying the audio, making sure every word was crystal clear. He was about to send it to Jared when, bang, 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 a fist slammed against his front door. Shaq shot up, heart hammering. He checked the security monitor. 2 men in suits stood outside, their faces shadowed by the porch light. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. Who is this? A cold voice spoke. We know what you did. Shaq's grip on the phone tightened. You have 7 days to leave, Mr. Johnson. The voice continued. Or we make sure you regret it. The line went dead. Shaq exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He had the evidence. But now, they knew he had it, and they weren't about to let him use it without a fight. Shaq adjusted his tie, his reflection staring back at him from the courthouse window. He looked confident, unshaken, but inside his pulse was a steady drumbeat of tension. This was it, the final stand. His lawyer, Jared Holloway, walked beside him, briefcase in hand. We have them, Jared said firmly. The recording proves they targeted you. This should be a slam dunk. Shaq exhaled, nodding. He had fought too hard to lose now. The evidence was damning. Secret HOA recordings, fabricated violations, and a long history of black homeowners mysteriously forced out. Today, the truth would finally be undeniable. As they stepped inside, the HOA board sat smugly at their table. Richard Langston met Shaq's gaze with a smirk. The arrogance was infuriating, but Shaq didn't let it shake him. They were about to lose. The judge entered. The courtroom fell silent. The case began. Jared started strong. Your Honor, this isn't about zoning laws or HOA violations. This is a coordinated campaign to force my client out of his home using deception, intimidation, and legal loopholes. He played the recording. The courtroom stilled as Langston's voice filled the air. Johnson won't be a problem anymore. The zoning board will handle it. And if that doesn't work, we have other methods. A murmur rippled through the audience. The judge frowned, leaning forward. Langston's lawyer scrambled to respond, but the damage was done. Shaq could feel it. They were winning. Until the unexpected happened. Langston's lawyer stood. We have a key witness to clarify this situation. Shaq barely reacted. He expected one of Langston's lackeys to take the stand. Another desperate attempt to spin their corruption into something reasonable. Then the courtroom doors opened, and Daniel Carter walked in. Shaq's stomach dropped. Daniel avoided his gaze as he stepped onto the witness stand. Jared straightened. Mr. Carter, you live in Ocean View Estates, correct? Daniel nodded. Yes, I do. Jared clasped his hands. You've spoken with my client multiple times. Would you say he was unfairly targeted by the HOA? A pause. Then Daniel looked Shaq dead in the eyes and lied. No, he said. Shaq was always causing problems. He ignored HOA guidelines and picked fights with neighbors. If anything, they were patient with him. The courtroom shifted. Shaq's fingers curled into fists. His heartbeat slammed against his ribs. Jared stepped forward. Mr. Carter, are you aware that the HOA has a history of targeting black homeowners? Daniel forced a fake frown. I've never seen any proof of that. Jared's voice tightened. Then how do you explain the violations that appeared only after Shaq moved in? Daniel shrugged. Honestly, I think he just didn't respect the rules. Shaq felt like the air had been knocked out of him. Daniel was their last card, their final trap, and the judge was buying it. 15 minutes later, the judge shuffled his papers. His voice was even, but final. Given the conflicting testimonies and the unresolved zoning disputes, the court rules in favor of the HOA. Mr. Johnson, you have 24 hours to vacate the property. Shaq barely heard the gasps around him. His hands gripped the table to steady himself. He turned to Jared, but Jared wasn't looking at him. His lawyer's face was tight with frustration. He knew they had just been outplayed. Langston smirked from across the room. Shaq had one day left. He was about to lose everything. The courtroom was suffocating with tension. Every seat was filled, the air thick with murmurs as the judge settled into his chair. The HOA's legal team sat smugly at their table, Richard Langston at the center, hands folded neatly as if he'd already won. Shaq sat across from him, jaw clenched, fury simmering beneath his calm exterior. They had blindsided him once, but he wasn't leaving this courtroom without a fight. Jared Holloway, his lawyer, stood slowly, adjusting his tie before speaking. Your Honor, the defense has built its entire case on deception, intimidation, and outright lies. But today, we're about to expose the truth. Langston chuckled under his breath. His lawyer, a sharp-suited man with slicked-back hair, smirked. Mr. Holloway, unless you have something new to present, this court is prepared to move forward with the ruling. Jared's expression didn't change. Instead, he leaned forward slightly and said the words that made the entire room go still. I'd like to call one final witness. Every eye in the courtroom shifted to the doors as they opened. The sound of heels clicking against the polished floor echoed through the chamber. Mrs. Kensington walked in. Gasps rippled through the audience. Shaq saw Langston's smirk drop in an instant. His lawyer turned to him, whispering something frantic. The real estate agent, once the HOA's quiet accomplice, now stood before the court with her head held high. She took her seat at the witness stand, adjusted her pearl necklace, and let out a slow breath. Jared approached her. Mrs. Kensington, you handled the sale of Mr. Johnson's home, correct? She nodded. Yes. I facilitated the purchase, handled the paperwork, and communicated with the HOA on his behalf. Jared's gaze sharpened. Did the HOA ever express concerns about Mr. Johnson moving in? Mrs. Kensington hesitated for just a second. Then she looked directly at the judge. Yes. The courtroom erupted into whispers. The judge banged his gavel. Order! Jared took a step closer. Can you elaborate? Mrs. Kensington swallowed hard, then squared her shoulders. After Mr. Johnson's offer was accepted, I received a phone call from Richard Langston. He expressed concern about maintaining the integrity of the neighborhood. He asked if there was any way to block the sale. Langston shot to his feet. Lies! She's making this up! The judge narrowed his eyes. Mr. Langston, sit down or be held in contempt. Langston sank back into his chair, fists clenched. Jared turned back to Mrs. Kensington. What happened next? She exhaled. When I told him there was nothing legally preventing the sale, he said, and I quote, if we can't stop it, we'll make him leave another way. A collective gasp filled the room. Langston's lawyer shot up. Objection! Hearsay! Jared didn't blink. Your Honor, this is not hearsay. We have emails and text messages backing her testimony. The judge motioned for the documents. Jared handed them over. The judge's eyes moved across the pages, his expression growing grimmer with each passing second. Finally, he placed the papers down. His voice was steel. Mr. Langston, do you deny these claims? Langston's lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time, he had no clever response. No smirk. No deflection. The silence stretched. The judge adjusted his glasses. Then it is clear. This HOA has engaged in discriminatory practices against the plaintiff. The zoning violations are fraudulent, and the eviction order is hereby nullified. Shaq's heart slammed in his chest. The courtroom exploded. Reporters bolted for the doors, phones out, already breaking the news. Jared turned to Shaq, grinning. We did it. Shaq exhaled, letting the weight of the moment sink in. He had won. But as he looked across the room, meeting Langston's burning glare, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. He had one last move to make. The same neighbors who had once whispered behind his back now stood frozen, staring in disbelief. The for sale signs had popped up overnight. One by one, the HOA board members, Richard Langston, Victoria, and the rest of their corrupt circle, had been forced to sell. Shaq owned them now. It had taken weeks of legal maneuvering, a few strategic partnerships, and a well-placed anonymous tip to the state's housing commission. Once the discrimination case went public, the HOA's reputation had imploded. Fines racked up. The lawsuits followed. And when the dust settled, Shaq had made them an offer they couldn't refuse. He bought every last one of them out. Now, he was in charge. A warm breeze drifted through Ocean View Estates as Shaq stood on his front lawn, watching the last moving truck pull away from Langston's house. The man who had once tried to erase him was now just a bitter memory. Jared walked up beside him, shaking his head with a smirk. "Never thought I'd see the day." Shaq exhaled, taking in the sight. "Told you. I don't back down." Jared chuckled. "And now?" Shaq turned, surveying his new neighborhood. The fear, the tension, it was gone. The families who had silently supported him, they finally had the freedom to be seen. And as for the ones who had tried to run him out, they had run themselves out instead. A slow grin spread across Shaq's face. "Now, we celebrate." That evening, the smell of grilled steak and barbecue ribs filled the air. Laughter echoed across the block. The biggest block party Ocean View Estates had ever seen was in full swing. The long banquet tables were packed. Neighbors, friends, even people from surrounding communities had all come together. For the first time in decades, the gates of Ocean View were wide open. Shaq stood by the grill flipping burgers when Dion walked up, grinning. "Man, you really did it," Shaq smirked. "Told you. If I was gonna win, I'd win big." Dion nudged him. "You know Langston's probably watching this from some cheap condo across town, steaming mad." Shaq laughed. "Good." He scanned the crowd, taking it all in, the smiles, the joy, the real sense of community. And then, his gaze landed on something that made his grin widen. At the entrance of the neighborhood, a freshly painted sign stood tall. Ocean View Estates, a community for everyone. And just below it, in fine print, under new management. Shaq took a deep breath, letting the moment settle in. This wasn't just a victory, this was justice. He picked up a cold drink, raised it to the crowd, and smiled. Now this is home. The gates of Ocean View were wide open. Shaq stood by the grill, flipping burgers when Dion walked up, grinning. "Man, you really did it." Shaq smirked. "Told you. If I was gonna win, I'd win big." Dion nudged him. "You know Langston's probably watching this from some cheap condo across town, steaming mad." Shaq laughed. "Good." He scanned the crowd, taking it all in, the smiles, the joy, the real sense of community. And then, his gaze landed on something that made his grin widen. At the entrance of the neighborhood, a freshly painted sign stood tall. Ocean View Estates, a community for everyone. And just below it, in fine print, under new management. Shaq took a deep breath, letting the moment settle in. This wasn't just a victory. This was justice. He picked up a cold drink, raised it to the crowd, and smiled. Now this is home. The gates of Ocean View were wide open. Shaq stood by the grill, flipping burgers, when Dion walked up, grinning. "Man, you really did it." Shaq smirked. "Told you, if I was gonna win, I'd win big." Dion nudged him. "You know Langston's probably watching this from some cheap condo across town, steaming mad." Shaq laughed. "Good." He scanned the crowd, taking it all in. The smiles, the joy, the real sense of community. And then, his gaze landed on something that made his grin widen. At the entrance of the neighborhood, a freshly painted sign stood tall. Ocean View Estates, a community for everyone. And just below it in fine print, under new management. Shaq took a deep breath, letting the moment settle in. This wasn't just a victory. This was justice. He picked up a cold drink, raised it to the crowd, and smiled. Now this is home. The gates of Ocean View were wide open. Shaq stood by the grill, flipping burgers when Dion walked up, grinning. "Man, you really did it." Shaq smirked. "Told you. If I was gonna win, I'd win big." Dion nudged him. You know Langston's probably watching this from some cheap condo across town, steaming mad. Shaq laughed. Good. He scanned the crowd, taking it all in. The smiles, the joy, the real sense of community. And then his gaze landed on something that made his grin widen. At the entrance of the neighborhood, a freshly painted sign stood tall. Ocean View Estates, a community for everyone. And just below it, in fine print, under new management. Shaq took a deep breath, letting the moment settle in. This wasn't just a victory. This was justice. He picked up a cold drink, raised it to the crowd, and smiled. Now this is home. The gates of Ocean View were wide open. Shaq stood by the grill, flipping burgers, when Dion walked up, grinning. Man, you really did it. Shaq smirked. Told you. If I was going to win, I'd win big. Dion nudged him. You know Langston's probably watching this from some cheap condo across town, steaming mad. Shaq laughed. Good. He scanned the crowd, taking it all in. The smiles, the joy, the real sense of community. And then, his gaze landed on something that made his grin widen. At the entrance of the neighborhood, a freshly painted sign stood tall. Ocean View Estates, a community for everyone. And just below it, in fine print, under new management. Shaq took a deep breath, letting the moment settle in. The gates of Ocean View were wide open. Shaq stood by the grill, flipping burgers, when Dion walked up, grinning. Man, you really did it. Shaq smirked. Told you. If I was going to win, I'd win big. Dion nudged him. You know Langston's probably watching this from some cheap condo across town, steaming mad. Shaq laughed. Good. He scanned the crowd, taking it all in. The smiles, the joy, the real sense of community. And then his gaze landed on something that made his grin widen. At the entrance of the neighborhood, a freshly painted sign stood tall. Ocean View Estates, a community for everyone. And just below it, in fine print, under new management. Shaq took a deep breath, letting the moment settle in. This wasn't just a victory. This was justice. He picked up a cold drink, raised it to the crowd, and smiled. Now this is home.